We know a lot of you have expressed interest in, really getting deeper into the Bible, not just focusing on individual verses or stories, but understanding the bigger picture, the flow of history, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for this deep dive, we're tackling a big one. We're going straight into the heart of it with 1 and 2 Kings in the King James Version.
It's a good one.
It's a fascinating journey through a pivotal period, a story full of, it's full of leadership, faith, the consequences of choices, those big themes that resonate even today.
Right. And it's interesting, just to start off, what we now have is 2 separate books, 1 and 2 Kings, were originally one continuous scroll in the Hebrew tradition, simply called Kings.
Oh, so it wasn't always 2 books?
Nope. The division came later, first with the ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint, and then centuries later, the Latin Vulgate.
Interesting. So right from the start, even the way the text is presented has changed over time.
Exactly. It highlights the journey this text itself has been on, even before we dive into the content.
Okay, so we're focused on 1 and 2 Kings, KJV, and we're drawing on resources that give us summaries, outlines, put things into historical context, and even offer insights from study Bibles, like the NIV Study Bible, just to get a well-rounded perspective.
A good approach.
Yeah. And the main thing we're trying to do on this deep dive, our mission, so to speak, is to, let's walk through 1 and 2 Kings together, hit the key points, the major narratives, themes like the covenant between God and Israel, and, of course, give you all that historical background, all within the familiar language of that KJV.
Makes sense. It's a lot to cover, but definitely worth the effort.
Absolutely. So, listeners, get ready to gain a solid understanding of this crucial part of the Old Testament, what it says, what it meant, and its journey through time.
All right, so where do you want to start?
Well, like we do with a lot of these books, it makes sense to talk about, the author, who wrote it and when. I mean, we're talking about a text that's been around for centuries.
Right, and as with many of the Old Testament books, we don't have a definitive answer on who the author was. Jewish tradition tends to point to the prophet Jeremiah.
Okay.
But most scholars these days, they kind of lean towards the idea that it was written by, an unknown author, someone who was deeply familiar with the book of Deuteronomy.
I see. So that Deuteronomic perspective, that theological viewpoint kind of comes through in the way 1 and 2 Kings are written.
Yeah, exactly. It's a perspective we see reflected in many of the prophets, that connection between obedience to God and the well-being of the nation.
Now, here's something that always fascinates me. The author didn't just, rely on divine inspiration. They actually mentioned sources they used, earlier writings, right there in 1 and 2 Kings. They refer to the Book of the Annals of Solomon, the Book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel, and the Book of the Annals of the Kings of Judah. What exactly were these annals, official records, like historical documents?
That's a great question, and it's one scholars have been discussing for, a very long time. If they were, official state records kept by the royal courts, would they really include things that made the monarchy look bad?
Right, like conspiracies and assassinations. We read about those in 1 Kings 16 and 2 Kings 15.
Right, and would someone compiling a historical narrative even have access to those types of sensitive documents? So some scholars suggest these annals might have been different kinds of records altogether.
Makes sense, like maybe records kept by the prophets. Because, we know from other books like Chronicles that there were writings attributed to seers and prophets like Samuel, Nathan, Gad, even Ahijah and Iddo.
Right, those were all prophets.
So you're saying there was a whole prophetic tradition of recording, like documenting and interpreting, how the kings were doing from a spiritual perspective.
Exactly. They weren't just foretelling the future, they were also chronicling the present. And their writings likely formed part of the material the author of Kings drew upon.
Fascinating. Now, when it comes to the actual date of composition, when all this was put together, there are different views, right?
Right. Some scholars favor a date after the Babylonian exile, maybe around the time King Jehoiachin was released from prison in Babylon, around 562 BC.
Okay.
That's before the exile officially ended in 538.
Got it.
But there's also strong evidence for an earlier date, even possibly pre-exilic.
Right, because you've got all those phrases throughout 1 and 2 Kings that talk about things existing to this day, like how the ark was carried, the practice of forced labor, things like that. It does sound more like someone living in Judah before the exile, making observations in real time.
Exactly. So some scholars believe the books were written in stages, maybe an initial version before the exile, perhaps around the time of King Josiah, and then later updates during the exile, around 550 BC.
Okay.
But it's also possible that the author writing during the exile, was simply using these, to this day, phrases from their earlier sources, without really updating them.
Oh, I see. So they're quoting.
Precisely. And we see something similar in Chronicles, which was written after the exile, using the same, to this day, phrasing when talking about the ark's poles.
Huh. Interesting.
So it leaves open the possibility of a single author living in exile, skillfully weaving together all these different sources.
Right. So the exact author and date might remain a bit of a mystery.
A little bit, yes.
But what's clear is the reliance on earlier writings.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's move into the themes now. What really jumps out when you read 1 and 2 Kings is how the history of Israel's kings is presented through this very specific lens, that of the covenant, the agreement between God and Israel established at Mount Sinai and later with David.
That's the heart of it, really. The books of Kings aren't just a straightforward timeline of who ruled when. They offer this theological assessment of each king's reign based on how faithful they were to the covenant.
Right. It's like a divine report card grading them on their obedience to God.
Precisely. And that explains why some kings who were really important politically might only get a few verses, while others who were either, super faithful or went way off track, they get a lot more attention.
It's about their relationship with God, not just their political achievement.
Yes.
Which is why King Omri, for example, who was, historically significant, he established a dynasty, made Samaria the capital, even gets mentioned on the Moabite stone.
A big deal.
Right. But his whole reign is summed up in just a few verses. And the key line is, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord and did worse than all that were before him. It's a stark judgment.
Exactly. The author's making it clear what matters most.
Covenant faithfulness above all else.
Precisely. And then you have King Josiah, who doesn't get a lot of detail in his early life, but then later, when he's reforming Judah, renewing the covenant with God, that gets extensive coverage.
Because that's what matters to the author.
We see this pattern throughout. Kings like Ahab and Manasseh, who led Israel into idolatry, they get a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And so do the kings who championed religious reform, like Hezekiah and Josiah, who are explicitly praised for their devotion to the Lord.
And it's interesting, every single king of the northern kingdom is given a negative assessment.
Every single one.
Because they continued in the sins of Jeroboam, their first king, with his golden calf worship.
Right. The author is tracing this pattern of disobedience back to the very beginning of the northern kingdom.
And then there's the covenant with David, which runs throughout the entire narrative, that promise of an enduring dynasty, often symbolized by the lamp that would never be extinguished.
Like a powerful image.
It is. It's the standard against which the kings of Judah are measured. Did they walk in the way of David?
Exactly. The Davidic covenant provides this sense of continuity and hope throughout.
Yeah, even in the darkest times.
Exactly. Even when things are really bad, that unbroken promise to David is there, hinting at God's plan for restoration.
Yeah. Okay, another thing that stands out in 1 and 2 Kings is the role of prophecy and, how it actually comes true. It's not just a random sequence of events. It's presented as God's plan unfolding.
Right. It's history with a purpose.
And the author explicitly connects specific prophecies with what actually happened, like the prophecy about building God's temple back in 2 Samuel 7, and then boom, Solomon's temple is dedicated.
We see the prophecy come to life.
Exactly. Or the prophecy in 1 Kings 11 about the kingdom being divided, and then, 1 Kings 12 tells us exactly how it happens.
It all ties together.
God is in control, guiding events according to his word.
Absolutely. And the prophets themselves are key players in this narrative. They're not just passive observers. They're God's messengers, actively calling the kings and the people back to that covenant loyalty.
We see so many prophets: Ahijah, Shemaiah, Micaiah. There's even a brief mention of Jonah.
Don't forget Isaiah and Huldah, and of course Elijah and Elisha. Their stories take up a huge chunk of these books.
Dramatic, powerful figures.
Confronting wicked rulers, performing miracles, reminding everyone of God's expectations. Their stories are vivid illustrations of the consequences of disobedience, but also the potential for blessings when there's repentance.
Even though that repentance is often short-lived.
Sadly, yes.
So putting it all together, what do you think was the main point the author of 1 and 2 Kings was trying to make? Who are they writing to, and what did they want them to take away from this massive history lesson?
Well, if we think about the likely historical context, the author probably living during or just after the Babylonian exile.
Okay.
The purpose seems pretty clear: to explain to a people in exile why they were there, It's a theological interpretation of history, showing how Israel's repeated breaking of the covenant led to the curses, to the exile.
Right, which had been spelled out way back in Leviticus and Deuteronomy.
Exactly. It's that cause and effect relationship. Disobey the covenant, especially by following foreign gods, and disaster will follow. It's a message woven throughout the narrative.
It's a powerful message and a sobering one. This wasn't just bad luck that happened to them, it was the direct result of their choices. And 2 Kings even spells out the specific reasons for both the northern and southern kingdoms' exiles.
It's very explicit.
But even with all that judgment, the promise to David, that enduring dynasty, it's a beacon of hope.
It is. Even those final verses in 2 Kings, with Jehoiachin being released from prison in Babylon and even given an honored position, that's significant.
It shows God's faithfulness to the line of David hasn't been completely extinguished.
Right. There's a suggestion that restoration is still possible.
It's important to remember, too, that the author isn't just focused on the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom had fallen centuries earlier, but the author still considers them part of God's covenant people.
Absolutely. The division of the kingdom isn't seen as a final rejection of the northern tribes.
Yeah. And historically, we know that a lot of people from the north fled south into Judah during the Assyrian invasions.
So a remnant of those tribes continued to exist in the south.
The author is taking this long view of a unified Israel, past and future, all under the covenant.
Very much so.
Now, besides all the theological and narrative stuff, 1 and 2 Kings is packed with chronological information. How long each king reigned, how their reigns synced up with kings in the other kingdom.
Yeah, it's incredibly valuable for reconstructing the timeline of this period.
Trying to nail down the exact dates can be tricky, though, right? I mean, these records are ancient.
It does require some careful detective work, but by cross-referencing the biblical data with other historical records, especially from the Assyrians, we can get some solid anchor points.
Okay.
For example, we can estimate King Ahab's death to around 853 BC, and the start of Jehu's reign to about 841.
Oh, wow, so specific.
And from those points, scholars can kind of work backward and forward, creating timelines for other kings, major events like the division of the kingdom around 930 BC, the fall of Samaria between 722 and 721 BC, and the fall of Jerusalem in 586. Those were all pretty well established.
But you said it can get complex. What are some of the challenges with, getting all the dates to line up perfectly?
Well, the synchronizations between the reigns in Israel and Judah, they've puzzled scholars for ages.
I can imagine.
But a lot of those apparent discrepancies can be resolved by considering things like overlapping reigns, a son ruling alongside his father.
Oh, right.
Or differences in how they calculated a king's regnal year. Some might have used a spring-to-spring calendar, others fall-to-fall. So it takes some careful analysis to reconcile it all.
Okay, so 1 and 2 Kings is a journey, a long one full of twists and turns and lots to unpack.
Definitely.
To help our listeners navigate this journey through the Bible, let's do a quick overview of the main sections. We start with what's often called the Solomonic era, 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11.
This is the transition from David to Solomon, highlighting Solomon's wisdom, his building projects of magnificent temple, his own palace, and then sadly, it details his spiritual decline, influenced by his many foreign wives and the threats that arose to his kingdom.
Right. And then, after Solomon's death, things get really interesting. We come to a pivotal point in 1 Kings 12, the division of the kingdom.
A huge turning point.
The 10 northern tribes break away to form the kingdom of Israel, and the southern tribes stay with Rehoboam as the kingdom of Judah.
And the consequences of that division play out throughout the rest of the narrative.
So then 1 Kings 12 through 16 is all about these 2 separate kingdoms getting established. We meet Jeroboam in Israel and Rehoboam in Judah, and then a string of other kings in both kingdoms.
And the authors make it clear, the rulers of the northern kingdom, they're consistently judged negatively, because they followed Jeroboam's lead with the golden calf worship.
Right, setting a pattern of idolatry.
Exactly.
And then we shift gears to this really vivid, theologically significant section, the ministries of Elijah and Elisha, which runs from 1 Kings 17 all the way to 2 Kings 8.
These are powerhouse prophets. We see dramatic confrontations, miracles, pronouncements that challenge everyone.
Elijah confronting Ahab and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, surviving the drought, that incredible encounter with God on Mount Horeb.
And his condemnation of Ahab over Naboth's vineyard.
Then we move to Elisha, who takes over after Elijah and performs all sorts of amazing miracles.
Like healing Naaman, who was a commander in the Aramean army from leprosy. He even plays a significant role in the political and military events of his time.
powerful stuff. Okay, moving along. 2 Kings 8 through 17 traces the history of both kingdoms, starting with Joram, also called Jehoram, who ruled in both Israel and Judah. This section leads up to the exile of the northern kingdom.
A lot happens here. Jehu's revolt, where he wiped out the rest of Ahab's dynasty and tried to stamp out Baal worship. The story of Athaliah trying to usurp the throne in Judah. And then, ultimately, the Assyrian conquest of Samaria and the resettlement of the land.
And then 2 Kings 8 through 25 zooms in on Judah, from the righteous King Hezekiah to the Babylonian exile.
We see Hezekiah's reforms, his trust in God during Sennacherib's invasion, then the wickedness of his son Manasseh, followed by Josiah's reforms, finding the book of the law, that revival. But it's too late to fully turn things around. And Judah falls to Babylon, Jerusalem is destroyed, and the people are exiled.
It's a devastating end, but then there's that glimmer of hope at the very end, with Jehoiachin being released from prison.
A hint that God's promises might still be fulfilled.
Right. And our resources also give us this helpful list of foreign rulers, all the Assyrian kings like Tiglath-Pileser and Sennacherib, Babylonian kings like Nebuchadnezzar, even Cyrus the Great of Persia.
Putting the biblical narrative into that larger historical context.
It's a reminder that these events were part of a much bigger picture.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into 1 and 2 Kings, let's just recap some of the big takeaways. We've seen how these books present the history of Israel's kings through this lens of God's covenant.
And how the prophets play this crucial role as God's spokespeople.
We've seen the consequences of disobedience time and time again.
Yet that thread of hope, rooted in God's promise to David, never fully disappears.
It's a powerful reminder, even today, that God's faithfulness endures.
And it makes you think, looking at those cycles of obedience and disobedience in the lives of the kings and the nation as a whole, what lessons can we learn about leadership and faith? How do these ancient truths apply to the challenges we face?
It's a question worth pondering. And listeners, remember, this deep dive was just an overview. We encourage you to explore 1 and 2 Kings in the KJV for yourselves. Dive deeper into the stories that resonated with you.
There are so many resources out there, commentaries and studies that can really enrich your understanding.
Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.
Until then, happy reading.